Hi everybody, very welcome to Mentour and yet another video podcast. As always, I hope that you're doing fantastic. So, today on the podcast, I'm going to be talking about rejected takeoff and emergency evacuation if it's needed. I have done a podcast on this previously as well, but today I'm going to be focusing more on the actual maneuver. So stay tuned, I think you're going to like this one. So, when we're talking about takeoff and rejected takeoff, we as pilots generally divide the takeoff phase into two different phases. You'll have the low speed regime and the high speed regime. The low speed regime happens when we release the brakes and start setting takeoff thrust until we reach 80 knots of indicated airspeed. That's about 150 kilometers per hour. After 80 knots, up to we'll reach our decision speed, which is called V1, it's called the high speed regime. The difference between these two regimes is that in the low speed regime, we are allowed to reject the takeoff, which means stop the aircraft on runway for basically anything. So if we hear a rattling sound or we feel a vibration or we get a master caution, no matter what the master caution is, we're fully okay to reject the takeoff below 80 knots for pretty much anything. After 80 knots, it's a different story. After 80 knots, we will have accumulated much more speed, which means that we have already eaten up quite a lot of the runway, and because of the higher speed, we will also have a lot more energy in the aircraft, which means it will take longer to stop the aircraft, and it will, if we do reject the takeoff, it will transfer a lot more energy onto the brakes, because the energy that we accumulate is increasing with, well, obviously increasing with the speed, but increasing exponentially with the speed. So before 80 knots, we reject for pretty much anything. After 80 knots, we reject for engine failure, engine fire, predicted wind shear warning, or if we feel that the aircraft is in any way unsafe or unable to fly. Okay, those are the only reasons after 80 knots. This is called being go-minded. Most airlines are go-minded. So what does that mean? It means that after 80 knots, we prefer to take any minor malfunction that we might have into the air, where we will have much more time to discuss it among the crew, to do any non-normal checklist that might be associated with failure. And also, once we're in the air, and if we do decide to return back, it means that when we land, we are going to have the full runway length available to stop, rather than what little is left of the runway when we have reached 80 knots and then we get the failure and we decide to reject. That's the reason. It's simply a safety measure, okay? Having said that, if we do have a critical failure and it happens before V1, we will stop for it. If we have a failure after V1, we will continue to take it up into the air, even if it's an engine fire or failure. Okay. The reason for that is that if we have reached our decision speed, that speed has been calculated on the fact that we need to have stopped or started the rejected takeoff attempt at that speed in order to have enough runway left to stay on the runway or clearway which is left. Okay, so if we would decide to reject a takeoff after V1, we will not be able to stop the aircraft on the runway, which would be very unsafe. That's why we never do it. Okay, I had a lot of questions about this. We do not stop after V1. Okay. So, how is it actually done then? Well, the rejected takeoff is, we practice this a lot in the simulator. The rejected takeoff will always be executed by the captain. Okay, this is why the captain remains with his or her hand on the thrust lever during the entire takeoff attempt up till reaching V1. When he or she hears V1, they remove the hand because it's no longer an option to reject the takeoff. So, we start, pilot flying will call, I have controls. They will increase the thrust up to 40% approximately. The reason for that is that we want both engines to accelerate up and have accelerated to approximately the same N1 before we press toga, because if we would press toga immediately, and one engine accelerates slightly slower than the other, we might get a lot of asymmetrical thrust happening in the takeoff, start of the takeoff, and we don't want that. So that's why we increase the thrust to 40%, make sure that the engines are stabilized at the same N1, and then the pilot flying will push the toga button, and the outer throttle will then help the thrust to go up towards the reduced N1 setting that we've calculated for the takeoff. So push toga, set takeoff thrust. Pilot monitoring will follow with the hand, make sure that the auto throttle is setting the correct thrust, and this is something I've also had a lot of questions about. Why is the first officer or captain following the thrust up? That is because pilot monitoring is always making sure that the correct thrust is set for the takeoff. Then, if the first officer is pilot flying, he or she will remove her hand, put it on the yoke, pilot and the captain will keep the thrust, okay, to be ready for any rejected takeoff. Now, the aircraft will accelerate at 80 knots. The pilot monitoring will call 80 knots, to which the pilot flying will call check. Very important that this check is being done, because it is both the divider between the low speed and the high speed regime, but it's also an incapacitation check. So if there's no response there, the pilot monitoring will look over and make sure, call again, 90 knots, and then if they get a response, it's fine, but if there's no response, we'll take it as a pilot incapacitation and will reject the takeoff. Okay. So now, let's say that we are above 80 knots, we're at 95 knots, the aircraft is accelerating down the runway, and suddenly we hear a bang and feel a yaw, and the pilot and the captain is interpreting it as a engine failure. Okay. The following will happen. Captain must call stop. Okay, there might be different calls in different companies. In our company it's stop, which is unambiguous, so both pilot knows what's going on. Any one of the pilots can call out the failure. Okay, but the captain is the one who is going to reject the takeoff. And then, in a slow but deliberate manner, the captain will close thrust lever, disengage the outer throttle, then move his hand or her hand, and manually raise the speed brake lever, select max reverse thrust, making sure that you have rejected takeoff braking from the RTO braking, which is the auto brake setting, or if the speed hasn't reached up to where the auto brake actually kicks in, you might have to give max manual braking and stop the aircraft. Okay. The idea here is that you do it fairly slowly but deliberately. It's really important that after you've closed the thrust levers, disengage the throttle, that you go for the speed brake, because what happens then is that the spoilers on the wings will be raised, which will kill all the lift on the wings. That will make the aircraft sink down on the brakes, so that you will have maximum effect on the brakes when the brakes are starting to work. Okay. Without that, the anti-skid will start kicking in and the brakes will not be as effective. So close the thrust levers, disengage auto throttle, RTO braking or max manual braking, raise the speed brake lever, apply max reverse thrust, stop the aircraft. Right. You don't have to do this very quickly. You should do it expeditiously and in a deliberate, clear manner. Okay? The pilot monitoring in this case, which is always going to be the first officer, will try to remember what the brake zone speed is. Okay, approximately, was it 120 or was it 95 knots? Something. Because we are going to have to calculate later on what the brake cooling schedule is, like how much time we need to wait for the brakes to cool down in case we can actually do another takeoff attempt. So, note the brake on speed, monitor the captain is doing his or her actions correctly, call out any omissions that might be done, so speed brake, something like that, call out 100 knots, 80 knots, 60 knots, runway distance remaining, auto brake disarm if that would happen. So basically just monitor the whole maneuver, making sure that it's working correctly. And then as the aircraft come to a stop, the captain will set the parking brake, possibly also turning into the wind if you've rejected because of an engine fire, for example, to make sure the flames are not moving in towards the body of the aircraft. And then the first officer, and this is very important, once you've stopped and the captain has set the parking brake, you have to calm down. The captain waits while the first officer selects flaps down to 40, which is the maximum flap setting, calls ATC and tells ATC why we have rejected approximately where we are. Okay, very important that it's done in that way. Once that's done, we go into the second phase. Now we've stopped. The second phase will be to try to solve the problem. So once ATC has been informed, the captain will ask the first officer, state the malfunction. To which the first officer will then monitor the systems, check if there's any master caution, or go and very deliberately go through the engine instruments, starting from the top, calling out whatever N1 value there is, if there's any sign of any severe damage, moving all the way down through the engine instrument, down to the fire panel. And they will stop there with saying there's no fire, or there is a fire, or an engine overheat. So in this case, for example, let's say that we rejected because of an engine fire indication. So the first officer would then say, okay, looks like we have an engine fire, engine number 2. The captain will look over and say, yes, I agree. I want the engine fire, severe damage, separation, memory items, please. Then the memory items will be executed. The first officer is the one who's going to do the memory items. So we'll start with auto throttle disconnect, disconnect. Thrust lever close and confirm number 2. In this case, obviously, the thrust levels will already have been closed, but you just confirm that the thrust level is closed. Captain will say confirmed. Check that the thrust level is closed. Start lever, confirm number 2. Captain will confirm yes, number 2. Cut off. Fire warning switch, confirm number 2. And it's very important that we confirm all of these. So all of these actions will, if it would be airborne, result in the engine losing power or being shut off. And that's why it's really important for every one of these steps that they are confirmed by the other pilot. Even if you're on the ground, we still do it. So engine fire warning switch, confirm number 2. Number 2, pull. Pulling it will shut off the fuel, oil, things like that to the engine. Now, if the engine is still burning, which it probably will, the first officer then continue by discharging the fire extinguisher. We have 2 fire extinguishers. Wait until you have a discharge light, and if it's on the ground, you can immediately discharge the second one. If this would happen in the air, you would wait 30 seconds before you discharge the second one, but on the ground, you can discharge it straight away. And then wait a couple of seconds. And the reason that you need to wait a couple of seconds is because the fire and overheat warning is temperature induced. Okay, so even if you've managed to cancel the fire, to actually quench the fire, it will take a couple of seconds for the temperature to drop enough for the fire warning to go out. Okay, wait a couple of seconds, smell, listen to everything. You might get calls from ATC saying that they see a fire, anything like that. Use all of that for your situational awareness, and then decide what to do. Okay, so here comes now step number 3. So you have stopped the aircraft, you have tried to deal with the problem. Step number 3 is a possible evacuation. Now, an evacuation is something that we don't want to do lightly. Okay, we do it if we think that there's a danger for people's lives inside. But we also know that an evacuation itself is a risky maneuver. People will hurt themselves when we evacuate. People will break legs, arms, things like that. So we look at each other and say, okay, what do you think? Should we evacuate? Yeah, it's fire indication, it's still on, let's evacuate. To which the first officer will then take the QRH checklist and read and do the evacuation items. Now, the evacuation items on the latest Boeing QRH checklist is read out by the first officer, what to do, and then it's responded to by the either captain or first officer, depending on whose area of responsibility it is. I'm not going to go through the exact items here, but that's how it's read. Okay, so it's a read and do checklist. Once the evacuation checklist is complete, the next thing to do is for the flight crew to evacuate the aircraft as well. Okay, I would look up, make sure that all the emergency exits are being illuminated as per my command to, this is an emergency, evacuate the aircraft using all available exits. That's part of the checklist. But making sure that all of the exits are opening so that they've heard it. Might be panic in the back, so I might have to call it again if I see that the exits are not being opened correctly. But then, once I see that they're being opened and the evacuation is ongoing, I will, if there's time available, pull the CVR circuit breaker, which is has a yellow collar around it behind me. That's to preserve any CVR, cockpit voice recorded data, for a subsequent investigation. And then always bring the load sheet to make sure that we can account for all passengers and crew once we're out of the aircraft. And then after that, we will evacuate normally using the forward normal exits, the same as the passengers. If they are blocked for whatever reason, we can open our windows and we have some emergency escape straps that we can put out through the windows and kind of climb down. But that's something that we do if we cannot get out any other way. Okay. So there we have it. You have the rejected takeoff, you have the problem solving part of it, and then you have a possible evacuation. Okay. Now, this can happen anytime while you're on the ground. So it doesn't have to be in connection with a rejected takeoff. It can happen during taxi out and taxi in as well. So remember that. Oh, there's a V-22 Osprey just flying outside of the window. I actually have to show you this, guys. That's not something you see every day, actually. Anyway, that will be the final today. I hope you found this podcast helpful. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.